Our study this evening is looking at Abimelech. We were introduced to him last week, and we are going to probably find out more than we would like to find out about him in our study this evening. And of course, all of this we understand are the things that have been written for our learning, that we are able to patience and comfort of the scriptures have hope. And so we see how God deals and how God has dealt with individuals. And certainly Abimelech was quite an individual. You know, there are occasions, both in the scriptures and I think in our daily lives, that we come across a person who seems to have really no moral characteristics whatsoever. And I believe Abimelech was that kind of a person. It's somewhat debatable as to whether he should be counted even as a judge, because he took unto himself the title of king, and Judges 9 and verse 22 tells us that he reigned over Israel for 3 years. And there's no indication, neither, that he was raised up of God, as we find out the case was with so many of the other judges, those that we've already studied, as well as those that we will be studying. And two, no doubt, as we read chapter 9, we could see that his sole intention, his complete total ambition, was to just simply to promote himself. And it almost makes him the oppressor of Israel, although, of course, he is not challenged as that, but certainly he is quite an interesting character. We do know that there are times when God allows ungodly men to take prominent positions. And that certainly holds true with the one that we're studying tonight. And really, you know, to add to this, the fact that the Holy Spirit saw fit to give us such a long and detailed description of Abimelech's deeds, then that would make us to think that surely even in the kind of a person that he was, still there's something for us to learn. There's something for us to benefit from in order for us to have been given this record that we have here in Judges 9. And this is like all of the lessons we can learn from the overall history of the children of Israel. We studied not too many Sunday mornings ago concerning 1 Corinthians 10, where Paul went into a great detail concerning the history of the children of Israel and how that though they were all baptized under Moses in the cloud and in the sea, despite the fact that they were people of God, yet God was not pleased with them and they were overthrown. And the last remark that was made in 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 11 says, now all of these things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our admonition upon whom the ends of the ages have come. And I double quoted myself there, upon whom the ends of the world have come. And certainly Abimelech was a part of Israel's history. So truly it's a thing that we can look at and hopefully that we can learn some things from. I asked you last week, if you would, before class time, to read the 9th chapter of the book of Judges, and I hope you did that. It was in chapter 8 that we read about Gideon's victory over the Midianites. And I hope that we'll recall some of those things that we discussed last week. You know, we ought to consider it is an unexpected reaction for Gideon to be approached by Israel to be their king. Surely he had put an end to the many 7 years of oppression that the Midianites, the Amalekites, as well as the tribes from the east had oppressed Israel with. And so he made a very decisive defeat of them. And obviously, the children of Israel were grateful. And that gratitude went so far as to the extending the invitation to Gideon to be their king. We know that at first he refused, and he insisted that it was to be the Lord that would rule over them. We remind ourselves of that in chapter 8 and verse 23. And yet, we talked about how that from all appearances, he seems to have assumed that role of being king over Israel for the 40 years that are mentioned in which time that the children of Israel had peace. And that is in chapter 8 and verse 26. So 40 years of peace under Gideon after he had defeated the Midianites and brought an end to their oppression. But sad to say, I think during those 40 years of peace, the seeds were being planted, which would lead to some horrible events that would soon take place. And those events are what we're reading about in chapter 9. The chapter records, we remind ourselves, that Gideon had 70 sons who were his own offspring, for he had many wives. And his concubine, who was in Shechem, also bore him a son, whose name he called Abimelech. That was in verses 30 and 31 of chapter 8. So that's when we were first introduced last week to Abimelech. And two, as we mentioned last week, that name, Abimelech, means my father is king, which, of course, is in fact the very title that Gideon refused to accept. So now, from the things that, sorry, pushed the wrong button. I used to go back through all of those. So now, from the things that we read in chapter 9, Abimelech, because of his connection to Gideon, is going to use this to his advantage. He, in fact, really, it ought not to be surprising that what we see in this chapter is he's determined to give himself a place of prominence. Call it a place of preeminence, whatever. But truly, the focus was going to be on him. And it ought not to be surprising to see how easy it was for Abimelech to get a following from among his mother's people, the people of Shechem. This is where Gideon had his concubine, which was located a little distance away from Gideon's hometown of Ophrah, but still, it's the people of his mother that Abimelech makes the appeal to rally their support for him. And when you hear the word or the name Shechem, that ought to be familiar with us. Maybe it is that we remember this was the place where that Joseph had made statement that whenever the children of Israel left out of the land of Goshen in Egypt, that they were to carry his bones with them and bury them in the land of Shechem. So that's what we read about in Joshua 14 and verse 32. This is the place for the final resting place of Joseph. But also, one other thing to consider about Shechem It's in Genesis chapter 34 that Jacob's sons, Simeon and Levi, sought vengeance upon Shechem. They killed all of the men of that city because of their behavior toward Dinah, which was their sister. So we see Simeon and Levi attacks the city of Shechem and completely kills all of the men of that city. And it's although supposedly belongs to the tribe of Ephraim. Another interesting thing is there's no mention of it being conquered in the book of Joshua, which of course deals with all of the conquering that took place in the land of Canaan. So, although what we're seeing in all of this ought to help us to see that truly the people of Shechem, they're in no way feeling any kind of allegiance toward Jacob's sons. And that could very well help to explain, in addition to the fact that this was Abimelech's mother's people, why he was able to rally their support, not just only their support, but their financial support behind them. So they were willingly able to finance Abimelech. What Abimelech did with that money was, in chapter 9 and verse 4, he hired worthless and reckless men. That's the New King James rendering. The King James says that he hired vain and light men. So not a very good group that Abimelech takes this money that the Shechemites have given him, and he rallies a force under his command that is of really, I guess it just sort of they match their leader, I guess is the best way to put it. Abimelech certainly wasn't much himself, and so it would take a person of similar character in order to take orders and to devote themselves unto him. And that's obviously what we have taking place here. The first thing that Abimelech does is to eliminate any possible threat to his rule. He goes to his father's house, to Ophrah, and he kills all 69. Remember, he had 70 half-brothers. He killed 69 of his half-brothers, and their blood fell upon one stone. In other words, the place of execution was that place where the death was met, at that stone. 69 of his half-brothers. There's only one escapes, Jotham. And you can pronounce this Jotham or Jotham. I find it a little easier to pronounce it Jotham. Jotham is the only half-brother that survives, and he does so because he manages to hide, as we're told in verse 5 of chapter 9. So, with this, Abimelech is made king in verse 6 that we read. When he becomes king, Jotham delivers a message. He stands up on the mountain and he addresses all of the Shechemites as well as Abimelech. And this we find in verses 7 through verse 20 of the 9th chapter. What he does in this message is he paints a picture of the trees wanting to have a king. It's sort of a parable in a way. So here are trees that are wanting to be a king or have a king. The olive tree, the fig, and the vine are approached one at a time and propositioned with their being their king. But we see that each of them refuses. And the answer they give as to why they refuse is that they all are producing something of value. Whether it was an olive tree, whether it was a fig tree, or whether it was the vine. He said, we're producing fruit, we're producing food for God's people. So, no, we cannot, we will not be kings. And then the trees, it seems as a last resort, turn to the bramble. The bramble is a worthless bush. It has nothing to offer, nothing compared to that of an olive tree or a fig tree or for the vines. This bramble has nothing to offer. In fact, instead, what it does offer is thorns. And you know what you can do in a nest of thorns. You can get entangled. You can get ensnared. So, with this sort of a parable, but it is a prophecy that Jotham is given to Abimelech, he warns that Abimelech's reign is going to end in fire. Fire from Abimelech to the Shechemites, and fire from the Shechemites to Abimelech. Interesting prophecy. But nevertheless, we'll see that this leads to that, well, let's just put it this way. Jotham's warning is ignored. And for a time, that is, for a period of some 3 years, things are going well for Abimelech. That we read in chapter 9 and verse 22. But then there's a chain of events that begins to happen, leading to Abimelech's downfall. We see that it might very well be said from the beginning of chapter 9, if you read that chapter, and I hope you did, that God had remained an observer of all of those events that we're reading about up through to verse 22. And yet now in verse 23, God makes his move. It's stated, God sent a spirit of ill will between Abimelech and the men of Shechem. They had been rallied together. As I said, it was Abimelech's kinfolks on his mother's side. They eagerly followed him. They eagerly financed his army for him to hire the lowest of the low for his soldiers. So now God sends a spirit of ill will between Abimelech and his men. God obviously has seen the blood that stained that one stone where 69 of Gideon's sons had been put to death. And now we see God is obviously permitting jealousies to take place between Abimelech and Shechem. When you have jealousies, that produces faction. And factions produce insurrection, produces contentions, and it produces murder. And we see all of that in these next few verses. See, what I want us to understand is God never has, nor ever will, relinquish his sovereignty with regard to the affairs of men and the affairs of nations. Let that be a principal lesson that we get out of what we're reading concerning Abimelech. God never has, he never will relinquish his sovereignty in the affairs of men and in the affairs of nations. If you don't believe that, go to the book of Daniel and see there over and over and over again how that God rules in the nation of men. During the time of Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar and the children of Israel being in the bondage of Babylon. See, those that are in position of authority, who think themselves masters of their own destiny and the destiny of others, they're all subject to God's will. No matter how haughty, no matter how wicked, no matter how much they think that the world is bowing to them, God is still in control. And all of the plans of the ungodly that we see that are played out here in chapter 9, they're only setting the stage for the final great events that have been already foretold by Joseph. So then, what we see in all of this is that the evil spirit that was sent by the Lord in verse 23 does his job well. We see that there are ambushes that are set up by the men of Shechem in the mountains. All of this we read about in verse 25, and it was to undermine Abimelech and his control, his authority. They attempted not they, but there is the attempted overthrow by Gaul. He just tries to himself overcome, put Abimelech down in verses 26 through 41. Then there are the messages that are sent by Zabel. This is Abimelech's accomplice to warn him of the increasing opposition that is taking place. Warriors, in what we read in these verses, they are maneuvered, plans and counter plans are made until at last Abimelech sets fire to the tower of the idol temple in Shechem. He breaks down the limbs, the boughs from the trees, and has himself and the soldiers to carry these and put them at the base of this tower. Obviously, it was made of wood, and set fire to it. And what we see from the result of all of this is that 1,000 men and women that have taken refuge in this tower, they're all killed. And this is as Jotham had foretold when he said there in that 20th verse, let fire come from Abimelech and devour the men of Shechem and Beth Milo. So here is a great victory for Abimelech. He carries all of this, sets fire to the tower, and in the process, 1,000 men and women die from just this single event. And then, with this success, and undoubtedly Abimelech expecting more success as a king, he attacks the neighboring city of Shechem, and that is Thebes. And it's almost like a repeat. What we find is that again the inhabitants of that city take refuge in a strong tower. Nothing is made concerning the mention being related to an idol, but they took refuge in probably a tower that was heavily fortified for against attacks. And again, Abimelech does what he does before. He goes and he gets his boughs, his branches, him and his soldiers, and they pile this all around the tower, and they proceed to set fire to it. But what we see is there's a woman in that tower, and she has a millstone, and she drops that millstone from the tower. And the Bible tells us in verse 53 that Abimelech's head, it hit his head, and it crushed his skull. And yet, Abimelech, being the person that he was, even in his death, we see Abimelech's pride is still all that matters. And, I suppose appearance is everything. And apparently that must have been what Abimelech thought. But what we see as a result of this, what Abimelech does is, it must not be said that Abimelech, the king and the mighty soldier, was killed by a woman. So that's why I said a moment ago, it seems that appearance is everything. Abimelech does not want the story let out that here in just a routine battle, just like one that had already previously happened, and he was greatly victorious. Now here, he's been struck in the head, his skull is crushed, but yet he's still alive, and in his last breath, he calls his armor bearer. Now, if we're not familiar with ancient armies, an armor bearer, he is the one that is very, very close to the king, or the one that's in control of the army. And he is responsible. In other words, I guess he's sort of like the Secret Service is to the police, to the president. If an arrow comes toward the armor bearer, is to stand in the path of the arrow. He's to take the arrow. So here is the armor bearer that Abimelech says, take your sword and run it through me. That's what we read in verse 54. And that's what the armor bearer does. Here, the man that's supposed to preserve the life takes the life, because it was what Abimelech said. I don't want it to be known. I don't want it to be said that a woman has killed me. And so this ends the story of a man who would be king, but a man who left God completely out of the picture. You read chapter 9, you don't see any appeal, any hint of Abimelech, even with God on his mind. But there's something I want us to note here that's interesting. It's interesting that the only other time that Abimelech is mentioned in the scriptures is over in 2 Samuel chapter 11 and verse 21. Jeremy, read that for us.
Why did you go near the wall? Then you shall say, your servant Uriah the Hittite don't do that also.
All right, let's get a little bit of a context of this verse. The occasion is Joab. Joab was the principal, the primary leader of David's army. We're talking about the period of David, the king. David has committed fornication with Bathsheba. And David has went through all of the things that he went through in order to try to make it appear after he found out that Bathsheba was with child, to make it appear that it was belonged to her husband Uriah. He brought him in from the battle. He sent him home. He didn't go in. He did all this and that, and yet Uriah still would not go in under his wife. He got him drunk, and that even did not work. And then finally, David wrote out a death warrant and handed it to Uriah for him to take back to the battle and deliver it to Joab. And little did Uriah know that what David had said in that note was to put this man in the front of the hottest battle, that he might die. Well, Joab does that. And when Joab does that, he is preparing himself, I guess you might say, for any kind of a comeback that David might question him about. And so this is what he said. He reminds David of Abimelech. Remember what happened to Abimelech? He was at the front. He was at the face of that tower. Here there was a woman that took a piece of millstone and she drops it and it kills him. So why did you go near the wall? If that's the question that David asked, why, Joab, did you go near the wall? Because near the wall, the archers are going to be up there on the wall. They're going to be firing arrows at you. I mean, that's the most likely place that you're going to get killed. But Joab commanded that to be done. And Uriah was there. And Uriah was killed. And that's what Joab reminds him of. Whatever David says, whatever accusation that he might come up with, here's what Joab reminds David of. Your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also. So see, Joab is giving explanation to David as to why he did what he did, because it was what David commanded Joab to do. And this is the only other time that we're aware of which the name Abimelech is used in the scriptures. This is just Joab's justification for approaching the wall of the city by calling David to mind the occasion of Abimelech's death. So, the one thing that Abimelech did not want to be remembered, he is remembered anyway. He was remembered by Joab to David, and guess what? We're here studying it today. 2,000, well, way under more than 2,000 years later. This is going way back into the Old Testament period of time. So we're probably looking at 3,000. Who knows? But we're still reading about it today. The very thing that Abimelech did not want to be remembered by. So when it comes to the lesson that we are in hopes of learning, is that Abimelech's power, his prosperity, and his success meant absolutely nothing when God intervened. God was displeased with both Abimelech and the men of Shechem. He was displeased with the course of it. He sets the course for them to destroy each other, just like Jotham prophesy. What this ought to do is it ought to teach us that no matter how much clout, no matter how much power people seem to have, sooner or later, God will deal with them. And often it's in a way that no one ever expects. We would not have expected Abimelech's life to have come to an end the way it did. Of all things, who would have imagined? Abimelech met a very abrupt and just end, despite seeming to hold throughout his life the upper hand. And we can only imagine what he must have thought. Here's a man that his father, my father is king. He finds it very easily to gain influence and respect or whatever in the way of leadership. You can only imagine, he says, well, people support me. 1 minute. I've ruled for 3 years here. I'm winning my battles. I'm successful. No doubt these are the things that he's telling himself. And then suddenly, his skull is crushed in a routine battle that looked like it was just a carbon copy of a battle that had just previously occurred in another city. So then, even though it may seem to us as if nothing is being done to stop evil people, let us be confident that God will deal with them in the long run. I really think this is a principal lesson that we need to take away from Judges chapter 9. There's an age-old question that's asked, and one that we often ask today: why do the wicked prosper? You ever asked that question? How is this person getting away with this stuff? Why does God allow it? Jeremiah 5, verse 28, Rod.
They have grown fat, they are asleep. Yes, they surpass the deeds of the wicked. They do not plead the cause of the fatherless. Yet they prosper, and the right of the needy they do not defend.
All right, Mike, read this chapter 12, verse 1.
Righteous are you, O Lord, when I fled to you. Yet let me talk with you about your judgment. Why does the way of the wicked prosper? Why are those happy who deal so treacherously?
So it was a question that's been asked a long time ago. So it's not a question new for us to ask. So let's let the story of Abimelech help us to see and understand God repays the wickedness of bad people, even when justice seems to be delayed. Rex, read us Ecclesiastes 8 and verse 11.
Because sinners against an evil word does not persecute speedily, therefore the heart of the sons of men is full set in them to do evil.
All right. See, God doesn't always intervene and bring justice immediately. At times he waits. And the reason may be for a number of reasons. Perhaps he wants to give people the time to repent. We're told in 2 Peter 3 and verse 9, he's long suffering, not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. And, in connection with this verse, we're all thankful when he does this for us. But I think sometimes we're less thankful when he does it for others. Sometimes he has other reasons for waiting. And those are reasons that we can't even imagine. We talked about Sunday that God's thoughts and God's ways are different than ours. Sometimes you may just simply choose to let things play out for a time, to let people experience the consequences of their actions. And then, too, in some cases, he won't bring justice until after Christ's return. Whatever God is doing in any particular situation, we can be assured that he is not, as we sometimes hear that statement made, asleep at the wheel. He is in control. And sooner or later, he will deal with evil. So that's our story of Abimelech. And time's up. Second bell rang already?
Okay. Maybe another minute or two.
Okay. But I think we're finished.
No, that's it.
Lord willing, next Wednesday, we'll Tola and Jair, just 5 verses that talks about them. That's in chapter 10, verses 1 through 5. So we'll look at them, what little bit there is said about them, and then we'll go to a much more detailed, much more information is given to us on Jephthah. So I urge you to read chapter 10 of Judges all the way through 10, 11, and up through verse 7 in chapter 12. So I urge you to do that between now and next Wednesday evening, Lord willing. And thank you so very much for our time being together and for our being able to study.